Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. You know what I was thinking, John? Now that the growing season is finished, I was kind of thinking, okay, now the months coming up, we've got November, December, January, February, March, most of April. So we've got 6 months kind of until we'll begin the active outdoor gardening. So 6 months. So 6 months kind of on the active gardening outside, 6 months off. And I like that.
Yep.
You know, because when the garden season hits again, it's like you got a renewed vigor for it.
Yep.
You know, it's fresh again. You see this thing's popping out in the springtime, and it's like, wow. So I'm actually kind of glad that we have that wintertime rest. And so I love gardening in our area. I'm kind of glad I don't garden in the tropics because maybe you'd get too accustomed to it. So I love this. But what I love about what we're going to talk about today is houseplants, because that kind of satisfies that growing itch. So I'm looking forward to today's podcast.
Right. We're not going dormant, and especially not as a podcast. We will keep making podcasts throughout the winter, just so people know.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about in the wintertime.
But you know, we're gonna talk. We're taking a rest from outdoor gardening, turning indoors, and along with indoors, in addition to doing some houseplants, one of my favorite things about indoors in fall and winter,
what's that?
Is baking.
Oh yeah.
So we're going to kind of look at this as some kind of we've got some no-fail recipes for houseplants in the winter that we're going to get to. But first of all, I gotta ask you, you know, when we're talking about houseplants, do you know why some people are so attached to their houseplants?
No.
Well, because they're soil mates.
That's great.
But you've pitched this before as kind of a no fail kind of you align it with a recipe for how to have a successful indoor gardening or rather houseplant.
Well, you know, I'm always leery if somebody says this is a no fail recipe, because if somebody can fail on no fail fudge, you know, I would be able to fail on no-fail fudge. And, you know, also when you ask somebody for directions, I'm leery when they say you can't miss it because, well, I can probably miss it. But, you know, it's funny. I really do feel with houseplants that by following this recipe that I'll call a no-fail recipe, if you follow this, I really believe that anyone can have success with houseplants. And, you know, I'm oftentimes, when I'm talking gardening with people, some people will say, you know, I just don't have a green thumb. I just don't have it. And I disagree with them, because a green thumb is nothing more than giving plants, either indoor or outdoor, giving plants what they need to thrive. And any of us can learn that. You know, we all know people who instinctively have a green thumb. They just instinctively give plants what they need. You know, my mom, grandmother, man, they just did what was right. Okay, so that's one way, instinct. The other people, you know, we can learn by experience. You know, with our houseplants, you know, if we kill a few, well, next time let's not do what we did to kill them. And so experience is a good teacher. So we can just kind of learn by doing. The other thing, we can study. You know, we can listen to podcasts. I enjoy listening to podcasts because I pick up gardening tips. And so we can study. And so I think from one of those three methods, I think any of us can have a green thumb. And that's why I call this the no-fail recipe for houseplant success, because I really do believe that by following the methods, we can all have success with houseplants.
Well, let's start with some baseline things there. And so when someone goes out looking for a houseplant, what's the best first step?
Well, I think the best first step is to start with a good, healthy plant. You know, something from a garden center. And there's some nice new houseplant stores around that are exclusively houseplants. And also the locally owned garden centers have really gotten on board with the houseplant craze and fever. So the garden centers are selling a lot of really nice houseplants. And so whether you start your own houseplant, maybe from cutting, maybe somebody gives you a plant, but to make sure it's a good, healthy, husky plant. You know, there's nothing more discouraging than starting with kind of a weak, spindly plant and thinking that somehow you're going to resurrect that into beauty. So there's a good case of letting something go. If right now, if you don't think you're growing houseplants, if you don't think you can grow a houseplant because the plant you're currently working with is all kind of spindly and just sitting there, well, maybe it's time to throw it out and start with something really good. So I really encourage all of us to start with a good, husky, fresh houseplant and proceed on from there.
So just speaking of that, talking about the different house plants that garden centers will have now, just out of curiosity, because you owned a garden center about, 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And
exactly,
I just wanted to see, like, how would you say that houseplants, the availability and the diversity in houseplants, just to give us an idea, how has that changed, do you think, over the last 2 decades?
It has changed dramatically. We were basically a full-service garden center. We did landscaping, sodding, Christmas trees, bedding plants, perennials, trees, shrubs. We did not sell houseplants.
Okay.
There was not the demand. And again, it was actually going on 19 years that we closed our garden center.
Okay.
But we had it for the 25 years previous. And houseplants were a thing then, but they weren't sold at the garden centers the way they are now. They were sold more at flower shops, florists maybe. Okay. But now I noticed almost all locally owned garden centers have a really nice houseplant section. So it has really, we are in good times, houseplant-wise. The other thing that I really enjoy when I go to the local garden centers or greenhouses, floral shops, when I see the types of houseplants. Pothos has been around a long time. Right. Now I see some nice lime green varieties of pothos, and I see the new cultivars. So the plant breeders have been busy. They've got so many more types of houseplants now for us to enjoy. So we are in houseplant good times.
Okay, so what are some tried and true? What are the most successful houseplants? If someone's looking for a name, like what are some ones to go out and look for?
Well, I mentioned pothos. That's a good one. Heartleaf philodendron. And philodendron is a big group of plants, all the way from kind of the vining type heartleaf philodendron up to those that become almost like tropical shrubs with great big wide leaves. So philodendrons are great choices. And English ivy is one of my favorites. The cacti and succulents. They are so great. There's so many different types, and they're so forgiving. For somebody that maybe doesn't want to have to pay attention to watering weekly, well, succulents and cacti are for those. And spider plant. I love spider plant because they're so fun to watch. They send out all the little babies. And if the spider plant someday becomes old and overgrown, you can start one from all the little babies. So spider plant is always fun. Peperomia. There's lots of different type of peperomia. Peace lily, which is sometimes called the funeral plant because they're used a lot for funeral gift plants. And those are very easy to grow, low light. And, what else? Another one that I've got that I really like is the arrowhead plant, also called nephthyitis, but the arrowhead plant with a leaf shape that is very descriptive like that, and several different types of that. And really, there are such a wide variety. I like ferns. If you keep the humidity up and kind of watch, don't let them dry out too much. One of my favorites is the rabbit's foot fern, which is so descriptive. Yeah, look up rabbit's foot fern. It's well named because it sends out kind of little rabbit's feet. They're fuzzy and look just like rabbit's feet that kind of cling over the edge of the pot. And Boston fern, Boston fern can drop a lot of stuff, can be a little messy, but they're so beautiful. But, we clean up after pets too, don't we? So I think of houseplants as pets. So if a Boston fern drops a little something, well, we need to clean up pet hair once in a while too.
When we talk about planting outside, we talk about knowing how big your plant will be in relation to where it's going to be planted. Obviously, when you've got a house plant, you're planting in a pot, so you can maybe move it around. It's maybe a little bit more forgiving as far as space and dimension that it'll be taking up. But what should you take into consideration when you're growing houseplants and when the pots that they're in? Because some plants, will they outgrow their pots?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, and so when a person buys a new plant, oftentimes they're in a little plastic pot, maybe, just kind of a greenhouse type pot. They're not always in a decorative pot that you'd maybe use, or even a clay pot. So when you buy a new house plant, and if it's in a plastic pot, one way to check to see does that plant need repotting right away, or maybe not right away, is to slip it out of the pot. I just turn the plant on its side a little bit, maybe knock the pot on the edge of the table, which loosens it a little, and the pot will usually slip right off without having a lot of dirt fall off or something. Or if it won't come right out, run a knife along the inside of the pot. That will loosen it. So examine the plant's root system. If the roots are all wound around in a tight ball, which is common, nothing wrong with that. But if you don't see any free potting mix in the root zone, then it probably needs repotting. If it's tight and you see no free soil, then it maybe needs repotting. But if you can see some potting mix in there, it's still got some root room to grow. So when you're repotting a plant, or when you buy a new plant and you don't want it maybe in that plastic greenhouse type pot that it might be in, and you want to put it in your own pot, we'll talk about pots in a minute, clay pot or a ceramic, you don't always need to increase the pot size. For example, if it looks like it's not totally root bound and you want to put it in a new pot, maybe the same size pot is fine. Or maybe just increase it a little bit in diameter. And when I say a little bit, if it's currently in a 4-inch pot, maybe go up to a 5-inch pot. That'll give a little bit of room around the outer perimeter for a little fresh potting mix. One thing to be very careful of is putting a young plant in too large of a pot, because plants seem to have a kind of a comfort zone. They like to fill up the pot with roots, and that seems to give them comfort. And then as they become too pot bound, then we can increase the pot size just a little bit. Like I say, if you're repotting, then usually maybe increase the pot size only 1 inch for a smaller plant, or maybe 2 inches in diameter for a larger plant. The danger is if a little plant is potted into too big of a pot, it tends to wallow in too much potting mix. There's danger of overwatering, and they just don't seem to grow as well. So, we might think, okay, I've bought this new little plant, so I don't have to repot it for quite a few years. Why don't I put this little plant in a big pot and let it grow? But that doesn't work as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's so only increase the pot size relatively small, I guess I'm trying to say.
Incrementally.
Gradually.
Yeah.
Incrementally. That's the word I was searching for. Thanks.
Okay. Well, so what are the best types of pots? I mean, you talked about plastic, you talked about ceramic. What do you use? What would you recommend?
I still like the clay pots, the unglazed clay pots. You can buy those at a lot of the national chains.
The old terracotta ones?
The terracotta pot,
okay.
Yeah. The reason I like those is because they breathe through the sides. That unglazed terracotta clay pot will exchange oxygen with the roots. And so overwatering is a common problem for a lot of houseplant owners. And because they will breathe through the sides of the pot, overwatering is less of a risk with those. And so many plants just do well in those. I like those. The number one thing with whatever pot you choose is that it has a bottom drainage hole. That's very important, so that any excess water, if you happen to put too much on, it'll drain out the bottom and we can dispose of it. If it doesn't have a drainage hole, there's always a danger of water puddling up in the bottom, and then that can lead to root rot very soon. And so what about some of the other type pots, the ceramics, some of the decorative type things? They'll work too. They don't have the air exchange out the sides like the unglazed clay pots do, but they can work just fine. Also, some of the type of plants that like to be kept a little more moist, such as ferns, then maybe a plastic pot or a glazed ceramic pot that doesn't breathe as much, they may actually work a little better because then they won't dry out quite as much. And ferns do like to be a little more moist.
Interesting that there's a different plants may like different pots.
Yeah, you could kind of tweak it a little bit.
Yeah.
I like that.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some potting mixes.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back. We're talking about houseplants, which we're excited to kind of get into this more this winter now. Now that the colder weather is here, our outdoor gardens are all bundled up for the year, but indoors, lots of room to grow. Are all potting mixes the same?
No.
I asked you that, and I know the answer, but I want to hear I want to hear what the difference is between potting mixes and what we should be looking for in potting mixes.
And when you think of it, the potting mix is really important, because where does the plant get its nutrients, its moisture, its everything else? It's from that potting mix. And so what we use is very, very important. And of course, we know in outdoor gardening, man, there's a big difference between gardening in heavy clay and gardening in sandy soil. And so outdoors, we're always wanting to amend our soil, aren't we, to make it really good so things grow well. Well, same thing with indoors. So for a houseplant, it's really important to have a mix. So what makes a good mix? Well, it needs to be able to hold enough moisture so that the plant isn't continually drying out, but also it can't be so heavy that the things will pack and not get air in, because the roots need air to survive. So the right blend of potting mix has that moisture holding ability, but yet it doesn't be too soggy and heavy. And so that's why when a person's looking for a potting mix, the less expensive, the cheap ones, usually aren't the best buy, because a plant is going to be in that pot for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Some people have left plants in the same pot for decades, and some plants can tolerate that. We can talk about that a little later when we talk about the lifespan of plants. So anyway, the type of potting mix is important because it's going to be in there for quite a while. So the way, in addition to price, just being cheap, inexpensive, the other thing that when I'm looking at potting mixes, I lift the bag. I've noticed that the cheap mixes tend to be heavy in the bag. And so you're kind of buying a little more moisture, but I'm suspicious how come they're kind of heavy. I'm suspicious that they're going to remain too heavy in the pot, too heavy, not drain well enough. So I actually, a few years ago, I bought all the different brands of potting mix that I could, the cheap ones, the expensive ones, and so I put them all in the same size pot. I watered them, kind of lived with them a little bit to see how they were, and big difference. And so I opt not to buy the cheapest ones. The more expensive ones tend to be better drained. They have that better moisture, oxygen compatibility. They tend to have the right blend of like peat moss or other organic material, and material that will drain well, like the little crunchy white perlite that sometimes you see,
or the
vermiculite,
little
and that's the perlite is the white ones.
Perlite, okay.
Vermiculite are the little kind of golden flecks, and that's important. So a good mix. So now the name that everyone will recognize is probably the Miracle-Gro potting mix. And, I don't endorse products, but that is certainly the most recognizable name. And that is one of the ones that I use for all our houseplants. It does well. There's a reason why it's become popular. So I like that one. The other one that I like are the potting mixes sold by the locally owned garden centers. They oftentimes have the same mix that they use in their greenhouses for all their plants. And locally owned garden centers, greenhouses that grow their plants, I mean, they're serious. They aren't going to use a poor quality mix that's going to make poor quality plants. So they use the good stuff. So if a locally owned garden center has a mix that they use, I have confidence in that too. So that's the type I use, is the leading brand, national brand, and also the ones recommended by the locally owned garden centers. I've had good luck with both. And one thing I should mention too, when you buy a potting mix, the good ones are oftentimes sold dry in the bag, and they're very light. So when you open the bag, they're almost powder dry, and that's hard to work with. If you pot up a plant in those mixes that are powder dry and you go to water it the first time, it seems things just kind of float around. So what I've really found works well is to open the bag the day before you're going to use it, add water to it, and mix it around good with your hands, and then close the bag up. The next day, that mix is so mellow. It's had a chance to absorb water. You're still going to have to water the plant after you pot it up, but it won't be so dry and powdery and little flecks of peat moss below. Have you ever used those, John?
Yeah,
those
yeah.
dry ones? And it's like, oh man, I'm breathing peat moss. They
dust.
Yeah, dust. Yeah, that's the word I'm searching for. They're so dusty, but they're good. And so by wetting them the day before, it just increases the usability so much and makes a much more workable product. So then, I really want to emphasize, because I used to use the cheap ones, and I could just notice after maybe a month or two, they were just so heavy in the pot, kind of caking together. And so, I guess we do get what we pay for.
We've talked about this before, but a lot of people still will put rocks in the bottom of their planters, in the bottom of their pots, saying, and this kind of goes back for generations. People learn this from somebody, but putting rocks in the bottom of their planters they say it's better for drainage. You don't believe that. Why is that? You are not of that school.
Well, and I'll get to that in a second, but when you say it goes back a long time, yes, I grew up in Lisbon, North Dakota. We were close to downtown Lisbon. We had an alley that ran right beside our house. And that alley, that gravel alley, is where my mom would get the pebbles to put in the bottom of her pots for drainage, in the bottom of her houseplant pots. And her plants grew beautifully. But in the meantime, fast forward, 40 years or so, now there's been some very interesting research that's been done. And they found that layer of pebbles, rocks, broken clay pots, or whatever in the bottom of that pot actually impeded drainage. Now, it's counterintuitive. Why wouldn't that increase? But what they found was that when you water the potting mix, and when that water meets that pebble layer, the water pauses. It's kind of like watering a sponge. When you start adding water to the top of a sponge, if you put a sponge vertically, then start adding water to the top of the sponge. The water goes down. It doesn't immediately start dribbling out the bottom. It saturates the sponge first, and then when the sponge can't hold anymore, then it'll start dripping out the excess out. Well, potting mix is kind of like that. So what they found was that when that water hit the layer of pebbles, the potting soil became almost super saturated before it would exit the bottom, and super saturated to the point that maybe a little too wet. And of course, that was fairly easy research to do. They could do moisture meters and things like that. So anyway, what I look at it is a time saver. I don't need to find pebbles to put in the bottom of my clay pots, or other pots. The main thing is it has a drainage hole, and then fill the entire pot, top to bottom, with high-quality potting mix. And that gives more root area. Excuse me. That gives more root area for one thing, because you don't have that layer of rocks in the bottom, so the roots have more potting mix to grow into. And also, they found that the drainage is just better if the pot is top to bottom with potting mix. Then you get a good drainage, and it'll drain all the way through. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have rocks in the bottom of your pots, don't panic. My mom's plants grew well, but she was also a very experienced gardener that made sure she didn't overwater those. See, with pebbles in the bottom, it could tend to overwater a little bit, but my mom was a good gardener. She knew to be careful of that. And so anyway, I don't mean to say that, if you put rocks on the bottom, your plants are automatically going to die. No, that's not the case. But I look at it as time saver. Since they don't contribute to drainage, let's just leave them out. Then I don't have to go look in a back alley for some for some pebbles to put in the bottom of the pot. I'll just leave them out. The other thing I should mention too is there's no need to put a coffee filter in the bottom of the pot, a diaper. You don't need to put anything like that inside. With a high-quality potting mix, I've never had it seep out through the bottom of the drainage holes. I also have a drainage saucer, but I've never found potting mix leaking out in the bottom. And so we don't need to put a coffee filter or anything at the bottom because some of those things could impede drainage a little bit too.
Yeah. When we're filling up our planters then with good quality potting mix, how high should we fill them? Should we fill them all the way up to the top? What would you recommend?
This sounds like kind of like splitting hairs a little bit, but I've never seen, what we're about to talk about, I've never seen written about, but over the years I've noticed what we're going to talk about, and that's how full you fill a pot with soil. And now here's when a few years ago, I started noticing that when I would be sent photos of plants that were ailing, houseplants, I would notice that the soil was way down in. It wasn't close to the upper rim of the pot, but the soil was sunken down in. Now, the space at the top of the pot between the soil and the rim of the pot, that's called the head space. And I would notice that plants that were ailing had this very deep head space. Maybe there was inch and a half of blank space between the rim of the pot and the top of the soil. And so all of a sudden it clicked on me. I'm seeing a correlation here that I've noticed for years. And so what difference would that make? Why, if you didn't fill the pot up all the way, why could plants be ailing? Well, one thing, if the soil is sunk way down in, air isn't moving across the soil surface, so you could get more mold. It's not drying out. You're not getting as much air exchange. And also, you almost have too big of an area that'll hold water. And so we tend to maybe put too much water on. Also, insects, that's kind of a neat little area for insects just to thrive down in there.
A little bit of shelter for them.
A little shelter. Yep, exactly. And the other, main thing is that if you're not using the full pot depth of soil, the drainage isn't as good. Now, here's why. Okay, if you're filling the pot up as kind of nearly as high as it can go with potting mix. Okay, that's a certain height, right? Okay, and gravity will help pull the water down through that height greater. For example, okay, if I'm at the top of a 30-story building, gravity is going to pull me down really pretty quick if I hop off. If I'm on a 1-foot step stool, gravity doesn't have as much pull on me if I hop off. So the same way with a houseplant soil, if you have a higher soil profile in that pot, the gravity is going to pull the water down with more force and get better drainage. And then it also pulls air in that the roots need. So do you see what I'm kind of getting at?
Yeah.
So if we don't fill the pot all the way up with soil to its maximum, we aren't using that force of gravity that is our friend in this case. So what's the proper depth? Well, you need a little reservoir up at the top to hold water. If you totally filled the pot with potting mix,
right,
well, then you go to water, it's all going to run off over the edge. So the best that I've kind of come up with is about a half an inch.
Okay.
And on the human finger, most of us, that first joint is right around 1 inch.
Okay.
So about half of that distance to the first finger joint is about the half an inch. Yeah, take a look at your finger, John.
Right.
Is about if you measure it sometime, they're pretty close to an inch. So anyway, about a half an inch is about right. That'll give you a reservoir for water, and yet it will fill that pot up with its maximum height of soil. If you follow me. So now what if currently you're looking at your houseplant and you see, wow, there's a really deep headspace with that. It's best not to add soil to the top because you might be getting too much soil up around that stem and you might get stem rot. For example, in a jade tree.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to, which are kind of like miniature trees, you wouldn't want to add all that new potting mix up around that kind of the trunk of that jade tree because it could rot. Instead, if your headspace is too deep, lift the plant out of the pot and put the extra soil in at the bottom of the pot.
Oh, okay.
And then set the plant back in the pot, and then it'll be at about, you might have to kind of work with it a little bit to get that half an inch. But it's interesting. It might sound like it's not all that big a deal, but I've just noticed the correlation. And then when I started thinking about it, then I thought, oh, sure, the force of gravity pulling it down and all the other things, that headspace is really, really important.
When we're planting outside, we tell people to look at the tags to see what zone the plant is grown in, what kind of soil it needs, and how much light it needs. What info should we be looking for on the tags of houseplants? What things should we take into consideration when we're looking at houseplants? That it may look nice, but how will we know if it'll grow well for us?
And I love plant tags. When I was a kid and kind of getting into horticulture, I think probably in junior high, we went to Kmart, and Kmart had kind of a pretty good houseplant section, and nothing had tags. They had no care tags, just nice little plants. And so it was kind of just stumbling on, what's this going to need. What I really like is in the garden centers now, most of the plants have care tags on with their identity and what they need. So the important parts of a plant tag for houseplant, number one is what light level. Is this a highlight plant? Is this going to need direct sunshine or a plant light that's really close to it? Is it going to need highlight, or is it low light? Because that really makes a difference as to where you put the plant. If you want a plant kind of in the corner of the room, off on a coffee table, well, then we need to choose a low light plant. So we don't want to take a plant that has a certain light need and put it where it's not getting those needs, because then it's going to start going downhill. So number one is the light level. That's probably the most important. The other thing would be if it has any special moisture requirements. On a succulent, the tag is going to say allow to dry out really well in between waterings. On something like the fern I mentioned, it's probably going to say stay a little more uniformly moist on those. And so we've got light, it'll probably say how tall and how wide, because it's possible to buy a little Boston fern in a little 2-inch pot, a little tiny one. And of course, it's important to know that that's going to become big. And so it'll probably have the eventual dimensions too on that tag.
And that's kind of a nice thing about houseplants too, because when we're planting outside, if you're planting things next to each other, yes, you have to take into consideration light, but you also have to take into consideration the drainage area. That you don't want to put something in an area that wants to stay moist with another one that wants to stay a little drier. You can't put them side by side. Here you can, because you can treat your pot. You can give one pot more water, and the other one, as long as the light's coming in and that their benefit from the light, you can treat one with more water. Yeah,
give them the individual care they need. Yeah,
so it's kind of fun to organize that way.
You also bring up a good point, John, but when you mentioned, even if you have plants kind of in a grouping, you can kind of give them individual watering needs. But also you bring up an interesting point, and that is houseplants seem to like growing in a group. I mean, we've got plants in our own home that are just by themselves here and there. But, it's interesting. Plants kind of like a grouping. I think they share the humidity and share kind of that. And in nature, of course, most plants are growing in a group of some kind. There aren't many that are just totally singly. I suppose a tree out on the prairie. I've seen some of those. But houseplants, they seem to like a group. So, if we group our houseplants too, I think they jointly do better.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about watering our plants.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
So this is a question that I have because I am not, as we've talked about, I'm learning gardening.
We all are learning.
We all are, right. But I'm on the making more mistakes end of things than maybe you are. We all make mistakes. watering plants can always be kind of intimidating to me. How do you know how much to water? And I know there's not a firm answer because all plants are different, but like, what is your take? How do you know how much to water?
On a houseplant, I think this is the one thing that gives most of us the kind of the most nervousness is how, especially when you buy a new plant, maybe you've paid pretty good for this plant, and when this plant is dependent on me to water it. If I don't water enough, it's going to dry up and die.
Right.
And if I give it over water, so I think a lot of us become a little nervous because it's not. It's not an exact science that, yes, once a week I'm going to give it, 2 cups of water.
Yep.
Because the frequency of water depends on, where it's at. What's the air circulation? What's the, temperature in the room? What's the light level? What potting mix it in? What type of pot? There's so many variables on it. So, how can we kind of tell how often to water these plants? Well, one thing that I'm oftentimes, when I'm talking house plants with people, they say, well, I think I overwater my plants. Now, it's important to know what overwatering a plant means. It doesn't mean that you put on too much water at one time because that excess water would drain out the drainage hole. So it doesn't mean you're putting on too much at one time. Overwatering means that we're keeping a plant continually too soggy. That's when we're afraid that this plant is going to die, from lack of watering. So then we add a little bit now, a little bit then, and it just stays too soggy. And plants do need to dry out. The soil needs to dry out to pull oxygen down on in. And so overwatering means you're just keeping it too wet for too long. And so anyway, when you do water, there's kind of a rule of thumb. When you do water a houseplant, to apply enough so that there a little bit will drain out the bottom drainage hole, and then you dispose of that. Empty the little drainage tray. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. Always put on enough so you're wetting the whole soil ball, and then let the plant dry out to a certain point until you water thoroughly again the next time. So when you're testing a plant to see is it ready for water, a couple of things that a person can do. One is you can lift the pot. Once you get used to a pot that's dry and then water it and kind of lift it, you can kind of tell almost by feel if that plant needs watering. But the way that I enjoy most is just insert the finger up to the first joint, and if you feel moisture at the fingertip, there's usually enough moisture there in the root system. The plant's usually fine. So skip a day or two and check it again. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, as you live with your house plants, they don't all have the same moisture requirements, of course. So cacti and succulents, you'll have to let them dry out much more in between. The ferns that I mentioned, they don't like to be quite as dry, so they'll need watering a little more often or kept a little more. So what we do is we take that rule of thumb, every time you do water, add enough to wet all the soil mix until a little drains out the bottom. So we take that rule of thumb, that'll apply to most our houseplants. But then we need to tweak it a little bit because you got your cacti and succulent that'll want to dry out more. We got ferns and a few others that will want to be a little more uniformly moist. Let's see, the other thing I was going to mention too on watering those what is this. Okay, I mentioned that when you water enough so little comes out the bottom drainage hole. After you live with a plant for a while, you'll kind of get used to about how much to put on, so you don't always have gobs running out the bottom drainage hole, because then you have to empty that. So oftentimes you'll get to a point experienced that you'll have just a few drops coming through that bottom, and then okay, it's good. But if you do have water that drains through into the bottom saucer, avoid the temptation to take that saucer and dump it on your next dry plant.
Why's that?
And the reason for that is because water, salts from the water, fluorine, chlorine, other things in the water tend to build up in the soil, in the potting mix, and the material that leaches out the bottom will tend to have leached out more of those salts and stuff, especially important with a plant that's been in the pot for quite a while. So if you're taking that water that has leached out the bottom, which probably has a fair amount of salt and other stuff in it, and then dump it on the next plant, you might be giving it some salty water. And so, yeah, I've been guilty of that because rather than going dump it in the sink, it's awfully easy with a group of plants. Here, I'll just dump it on the next one that I'm going to water anyway.
Seems ecological.
Yeah.
It seems environmentally friendly. Recycling, right.
And so anyway, but do be cautious. It might not be as much of a factor if all the plants are in fairly new, fresh potting soil. But if a plant's been in there 6 to 12 months, then there could be some accumulation of salt that you don't want to be passing on.
By and large, do you tend to err on keeping a plant a little too dry or keeping a plant a little too wet?
Too dry. There are many, many more plants that have been killed by keeping them too wet than too dry. In most cases, plants will tolerate. Even the peace lily that we mentioned. Peace lily, boy, when they get dry, they droop. But if you catch it right away, they perk up right away. And so if a person keeps in mind that many more plants have been killed by keeping them too wet than too dry.
I think part of the intimidation factor for me is at various times in my life, I've been in charge of somebody goes away for a couple of weeks over winter.
I know where you're going with this.
And you have to water their plants.
Oh, boy.
And
that is tense.
There is tense, and there's nothing worse than they're away, they're enjoying their time, and you're looking at a plant.
Because if they've got great-grandmother's Christmas cactus and you're responsible for watering it.
Yeah. Having this heirloom plant and you're not giving it, you can sit there and you can talk to it and give it as much encouragement as you want.
That is tension. That is pressure.
Yeah, you don't want to have somebody come back to dead plants.
You don't want to be the one that has killed their house plants. I'm oftentimes asked too, well, okay, so kind of how often then should a person water plants? Is it once a week, twice a week? But there are too many variables to set that type of guideline for plants. Okay, so the best is just to check your plant, insert the finger, check and see if there's moisture. And so for your own plants in your own situation, you'll probably be able to develop a schedule. But we can't give a schedule that's going to fit everybody's house, everybody's plants. It depends on the size of the pot, etc. But for example, the plants in our house, under our conditions, our heating, etc., the size pots we've got, I check them on Wednesday, and the key word there is check. I check first. If it needs watering, then I water them. Also, I check them on Sunday. Check them if it needs watering, water. In a lot of cases during the winter when the air is drier and all that, furnace running, I often have to water Wednesday and Sunday. In the summer when there's humidity, sometimes I don't have to water as much in the summer as I do in the winter time. So anyway, a key word there is check them on a schedule, but don't automatically water them on a schedule, because occasionally I'll check a plant on my Wednesday and Sunday, and I'll check it, and oh man, for some reason it's still moist. So if I had watered that on schedule, I might have overwatered it.
Thinking about all of this, and then again, my fear factor of killing someone's plants and living with someone. Sam does more house plants than I do. I don't do much with house plants, but I'm the one who works from home most of the time, so I should be contributing there by checking with watering. She says a number of times, don't water multiple. But I think what would be beneficial, I'm just realizing this now, is that if you're going to have somebody come into your house, or if your partner or your spouse is going to be, or your child is going to be taking care of plants, maybe put a little sticker on there that you color code that says this plant needs more water, or this plant should be checked more than once a week, or just put a little kind of indiscreet at the bottom over on the side there. You don't always have to see it, or make a map about what plants need more care and things like that, because that would help a lot if you've got somebody coming in
Yeah.
Just give them.
Because really what oftentimes happens then is when someone is taking care of someone else's plants, I mean, you don't want them to dry out and die on your watch.
Right.
And so you probably tend to overwater them, which can cause root rot, irreversible root rot. So you're probably, because you don't want these plants to be all dried up and wilted and dead, so you probably tend to overwater. So I like your idea of giving some individual TAG care instructions.
I've always been watering with tap water. Is that good or bad? Is there some other kind of water I should be using, or some waters that I should stay away from? Because now you have home water, soft water systems, and you have people who filter waters, and there's a lot of different kind of waters.
Yeah, there is. Okay, now I'm glad you mentioned soft water, because probably the worst water to water a houseplant with is water that's gone through a water softener, because many or most of the water softener units have salt added. You dump the bags of salt in, and so that's quite a salty water, and plants adversely react to too much salt in the water. And so water from a water softener isn't usually to be used. And sometimes there will be a spigot before the water softener unit, so a person could draw off some water that's non-softened. So if we talk about other city water, my mom always used that term, city water. And, when I grew up in Lisbon, the water was heavily chlorinated. So my mom didn't like to use city water for her houseplants because she didn't want all that chlorine in it, because chlorine can build up and adversely react to plants. So my mom would collect rainwater. Melted snow water. We always had a bucket of snow thawing on the radiators. She would always use that. And I guess as a last-ditch effort, if it didn't rain and it wasn't snowing yet, then she'd resort to city water. And, of course, one of the questions is, if we kind of let the water sit overnight, city water, will the chlorine evaporate or settle? There's a lot of discrepancy as to whether that helps. It certainly doesn't do any harm to let it set. That's probably a good idea. And fluorine in water, most of our cities are fluorinated also, our waters. And fluorine can build up. What some of these salts do, especially fluorine, is cause brown tips on plants. If you've noticed, spider plants oftentimes have a brown tip. And that's a reaction to fluoride and chlorine in water. Also, peace lily, very common, has brown tips. And it can be low humidity, but oftentimes it's that salt in the water.
I always thought that was getting too much sun and was burning or something like that.
Yeah, that can happen too.
But if it's not in direct sun, that may be why.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so certain plant species are very sensitive to some of these materials. Now, some cities, and I'd be curious to check what city of Fargo, I don't notice the heavy chlorine aroma in Fargo water like I used to. I believe some cities are using an ozone treatment. I should check and see what Fargo is actually doing. Now, I use Fargo water for all our houseplants. I'm not seeing the chlorine residue, and so I'd like to check and see how are they actually doing our water.
And it would also be interesting to see, too, if Fargo water and Moorhead water are different.
That's a good question.
With different water treatment facilities.
Yeah. But anytime you can use natural water, rainwater, snow water, and for some very sensitive, like if you had a high-priced orchid of a special species or a very delicate plant, a person might want to use distilled water or the reverse osmosis water. The jugs of reverse osmosis water, that you can get at the grocery stores and places, you fill up your own jug. That's not overly expensive. So maybe for an African violet or some kind of special plants that you had, I might even do that.
Should we be fertilizing houseplants?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting. Common question, too, is, gosh, my houseplant isn't really looking that good. In fact, it's kind of going downhill. Should I fertilize it? And the answer is no, not in that case, because fertilizer is nutrition for healthy plants. Fertilizer isn't medicine for sick plants. Even Miracle Grow isn't going to resurrect a plant from the dead. And so we have to be kind of careful. If a plant is going down, fertilizer might make it go down even quicker. So unless it's suffering from lack of nutrition, fertilizer, then yeah, we need to do it. But oftentimes if a plant is kind of sitting there, now I'm picturing a sickly plant in a pot. The soil is it looks a little moldy, like it's been maybe overwatered. The plant's got yellow leaves, it's spindly. That's not a case for where fertilizer is going to help. So fertilizer generally will keep a good, healthy plant healthy. Now, it's also interesting that plants are very growth reactive to the day length. For example, if you've got plants in your window where the daylight is its light source, those plants react to the day length. So, and when they react to day length, in the short days of winter, they aren't growing as rapidly, so they don't need as much fertilizer. So for fertilizing healthy house plants, we kind of roll with the seasons. So for example, in around February or March, when the day length is getting noticeably longer, then that triggers plants to start more growth. So fertilizing house plants really should be done like February, March, and follow the directions on whatever fertilizer you're using as to how often. Maybe it's a couple times a month, maybe it's once a month. But fertilizing the house plants such as March, April, May, June, July, August, September, and then when the days start getting shorter in October, then reduce or eliminate the fertilizing.
Okay.
And because they really don't need that excess fertilizer during the winter months.
If you had one single bit of advice to give a houseplant owner, especially a new houseplant owner, what would be the one thing that you would say just to give them? Like what's a one bit? To me, the most important thing is, well, first of all, enjoy them, but give them intentional care. And because I've got a neat, when I do a houseplant program, I've got a neat slide in which I have two different types of plants. One's a spire plant, two spire plants, two African violets. One of the African violets I give intentional care, and by intentional care, I mean a couple of times a week I check it for watering, I fertilize it during the months of active growth, and the difference in growth is amazing. The plant that I gave intentional care to is 3 times as large. The plant that, I didn't kill it, but I maybe checked on it kind of when I noticed it. Maybe a bit more passive.
I didn't repot it when it needed. Yeah, that's a good word for it. A bit more passive. Again, I didn't kill it. It was green, growing. And same with the African violet. So notice, I'm going to have to bring you that picture and show.
Yeah.
Nothing like show and tell on a voice-only podcast.
Let's put it up on Instagram. Let's put it up on our Instagram
we'll do
page.
It. Yeah,
that'd be
I'll
good.
get that to you. And so anyway, what I call intentional care with a houseplant, and to me, this is a key. Okay, in the same way that we give our pets, dogs, cats, goldfish, the same way that we give our pets intentional care, we're intentional about giving those pets care. And boy, do those pets ever respond.
Yeah.
We just don't kind of feed the pets kind of nonchalantly. But boy, if we give them the intentional care, that really brings out the best in a pet. And the same way with houseplants. Plants are a lot like people, other living things, animals, and they seem to respond to that intentional care, and it really makes a difference. Yeah, let's put up that picture.
Because a lot of it's kind of I'm not sure general wisdom, but that talking to houseplants really helps.
Yeah, I was wondering when you were going to ask about that. Yeah, do I talk to my houseplants? If by talking to houseplants, if we mean kind of communicating with them as to what they need, how are you doing? Are you growing well, etc.? Then, yeah, I suppose I'll say I communicate with them. How will that be?
I talk out loud at home, so when I'm at home alone. So I hope that they feel like they're being kept company in that way. But boy,
I tell you, that intentional care, to me, that is, being intentional about them. That makes a huge difference.
Well, if people have questions about houseplants or any plants, or want to send you pictures of their houseplants, what's the best way to reach you?
Best way is to give me an email, donald.kinsler, that's KINZLER, @ndsu.edu.
Well, Don,
And
thanks.
so if you send me, I should add, if you send me a picture of an ailing houseplant, I'm going to be looking to see the depth of that headspace in it.
Yes. That's always good points. This has been a really fun talk.
Oh, yeah. I love houseplants. It gives us something. It gives us, I guess, something during the winter time. It allows us to continue our gardening in just another fashion.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, and so I'm looking forward to talking to you again next week.
We'll see you next week.